Hello and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. So today we're going to talk about Weberocereus imitans. It's kind of the forgotten species of this particular type, ones with this particular lobing branch pattern. You'll have to excuse the fact that I probably sound a little bit weird and that I've been missing for a few weeks. It's because I went home for Thanksgiving to my parents' house and I came back with COVID, got very sick, and I'm on the mend now, so I might sound a little bit crazy. What's interesting is that there are 4 botanical species, and those 4 species are all classified in different genus. So it's really interesting that all 4 of these epiphytic cacti species made the same adaptations. So one thing that I will say about all of them is that because they have these cutouts, they have less of a surface area. So it seems as though all of them appreciate more sunlight. Some more than others, like Selenicereus anthonyanus is probably the highest light species of all of them. It definitely needs high light. Almost all Selenicereus are like that. Selenicereus anthonyanus, it goes under multiple different types of names. Unfortunately, we have these common names, these Ric Rac Cactus and Fishbone cactus. And unfortunately, those seem to have become kind of bizarrely interchangeable. And so Selenicereus anthonyanus commonly goes under or is sold under those names. The next one that we have is Disocactus anguliger. Now, Disocactus anguliger has been reclassified multiple times. It used to be classified as Epiphyllum, anguliger, and that led to a whole bunch of confusion. We now know that it's Disocactus anguliger, which explains why it was able to readily cross with other Disocactus. So anyway, that's a totally different story. Disocactus anguliger also is commonly distributed under these names of Fishbone cactus and Ric Rac cactus. Disocactus anguliger is the one that I would say really kind of popularized this type of cactus. I think that the reason why is because it was used in interior design heavily, because it was very much a statement piece. It grows very fast and it has a tendency to be a little bit more consistent. Whereas Selenicereus anthonyanus, if its light conditions aren't met, it starts doing some very strange things. So it's not quite so ideal as a houseplant as Disocactus anguliger is. And Disocactus anguliger, it blooms much easier than Selenicereus anthonyanus. But I will say that I had one. I actually no longer grow that species, which is kind of odd. I think that I will get another one at some point. But I grew one for about 4 years and it never flowered. And didn't grow very well either. I think it was actually a little bit more of lighting issues with that. Because as I said, the way that these are growing, because their branches are so lobed, they don't have as much surface area to absorb light, so they need to be in a higher light situation to get the same amount of light, if that makes sense. So I think it just wasn't necessarily in the ideal amount of light for 2 of those years at least. It is also one that has a lot of variation from clone to clone. There are a lot of Disocactus anguliger clones, so they can be highly variable in appearance. And Selenicereus anthonyanus, it has some variability, but not necessarily in the same way. The third one, this one is actually one of my absolute favorites. I love this species. It is Epiphyllum Chrysocardium. That one is distributed under common names, I think sharp-tooth cactus, fern cactus, or something like that. It is a really, if you actually really want a statement, houseplant, that would be the one. So that thing gets huge. It grows these massive branches and they're massively long and it's just this beautiful hanging thing. Getting into flower is a different story though. Unfortunately, getting that particular species to flower will take a very long time because those branches need to be quite mature before that happens. So unfortunately, the plant will literally grow you right out of your house before it flowers. But it's a beautiful, beautiful plant. That one too used to be classified as Selenicereus Chrysocardium, but is now classified as Epiphyllum Chrysocardium. And that brings us to Weberocereus imitans. Weberocereus imitans is the rarest of all of them. I don't quite know why. To my knowledge, Weberocereus imitans doesn't even have a common name. I think that essentially what kind of happened is that Selenicereus anthonyanus started being distributed pretty heavily as Weberocereus imitans. And I myself have had huge issues with this. And one of the big issues with this is that Selenicereus anthonyanus is quite difficult to flower. And it may not even flower unless you are closer to the equator because of its light demands. So I think that what happens is that either people made a wild guess and started distributing it, or there was a mishap during collection and somebody thought that this species was this Selenicereus anthonyanus, when they collected it, that they thought that it was Weberocereus imitans, and then that made its way into botanical gardens, and then that made its way into the public. But because it was so hard to flower, people didn't know that it was not Weberocereus imitans. And I think that I have picked up at least 4 plants, probably even more, with the label Weberocereus imitans, only to find out that they were Selenicereus anthonyanus. And in some cases, it was because they flowered. And the really kind of frustrating part is that they were coming from very, very well-known collectors. And I feel like they should have known. So I know that's kind of a weird shade that I'm throwing there, but they should have known that it was not right. I unfortunately have a ton of Selenicereus anthonyanus hanging around now, which is really crazy because it grows absolutely wildly insane. Throws aerial roots all over the place. If you try to grow it in a window or something, chances are it will start trying to climb into your wall. So it's a pretty hectic species, where I actually feel like Weberocereus imitans is really a sweet, nice species. It grows very beautifully and very nice. So I do want to hit on the fact that Weberocereus imitans is endangered. Looking at IUCN it is listed as endangered. The population is decreasing. It is native to Costa Rica. According to this, it really only grows in 5 locations in Costa Rica. The upper elevation limit is 900 meters and the lower elevation limit is 20 meters. For range description, it says this species is endemic to Costa Rica and is distributed in Punta Arenas province, Osa Peninsula, and nearby, and the valley subregion of the North Hillsides region. The supposed record from Honduras is likely to be a misidentification. It is found at elevations of 20 to 900 meters. So that's the thing that I kind of want to call out here, is that this supposed record from Honduras is likely to be a misidentification. So the reason why is because it may have been that something was collected from there and they thought that it was this, but it was actually a different species. And that's how sometimes even in botanical gardens, things can be mislabeled. It's actually really common. If you go through herbarium sheets, you can see for some herbarium sheets that the identification has been crossed out 4 different times and looked at by different botanists, and they decided that it was something else. So kind of confusing, but even things that come from botanical gardens can be mislabeled. Don't think that because it came from a botanical garden that it is totally correct. And even there, you could end up with some really kind of curious issues where something is in a botanical garden and then it's reclassified in the botanical garden is, the record from the botanical garden is not actually updated. Happens a lot. So, yeah. Again, the population is decreasing. It's really interesting because it says it is very scarce. Each collection locality is just one individual. So this is very, very endangered. This is a very, very endangered species. And goes on to say that it grows in seasonally wet lowland forests. So here it's got a little bit of a better description of that for habitat. It says forest, subtropical, tropical, moist, lowland. It is in fact an epiphyte, which we kind of knew. This is epiphytic cacti. Threats, it says the species is threatened by habitat destruction through expansion of commercial agriculture, especially for growing pineapples, and also clearance for urban and tourism developments. That is all kind of frustrating, and I feel like Weberocereus particularly is a genus that does have issues with habitat encroachment and endangerment. So you might be like, after all of that, how did I end up with this species? So this is a really interesting story. I obviously thought that I had Weberocereus imitans. There was a friend who was asking me to trade and was looking for Weberocereus because, much like me, it's just a genus that I absolutely love. It's truly my favorite genus because of the morphological diversity of all of the species in it. They are so wildly different from each other that I just find it super fascinating. So I think that my friend was looking specifically for Weberocereus imitans and Weberocereus bradii. And I sent them Weberocereus bradii, but it kind of came out that when this was all going on, I think that I had my first flowering of Selenicereus anthonyanus, which was mislabeled Weberocereus imitans. And the moment that I saw the bud, I was like, there is no way. So the bud forms. Sure enough, it is Selenicereus anthonyanus, and I am like, oh, good gravy. And then I think that when I looked at all of the other ones and I did some more research, I realized that all of them were just mislabeled. My friend did a bunch of sleuthing and actually ended up finding that a botanical garden in the United States sells this species. But the problem with it is that the botanical garden doesn't really sell online. They have a shop, but you actually have to physically go there to purchase this species. This actually came from the Fairchild Tropical Botanical Gardens in Miami, Florida. And so what was interesting is that my friend had a friend that lived close to there. And so he convinced that friend to go to this botanical garden and, pick up plants for us and then send them to us. It's really funny because some people are like, I filled out import paperwork. But for some of these you're not even going to be able to import it. And so this is one case where this was not really importable because you couldn't find it anywhere. And it's funny, there are other botanical gardens that do have this species. And I know that I've seen Huntington Botanical Garden photographs. So I know that there are other botanical gardens that do have this species. But it was really, really funny. And so even worse than that, though, is what happened was that the friend of the friend went and picked these plants up. And it was very, very early spring. And I live in Duluth, Minnesota. And so anyone who lives in the Midwest knows that the weather is just totally unpredictable, especially in early spring. So what ended up happening is that he shipped this plant to me, and unfortunately, right afterwards, there was a sudden cold snap. And so the temperatures outside were below freezing. And I was like, oh my goodness, right? So I'm about to get this plant that I've wanted for forever, and it's freezing outside. And there was no heat pack because just prior to that, it definitely was not freezing. It was 55, 60 degrees when it was shipped, and then all of a sudden this cold snap. So I am like super stressed out. I get the plant. I immediately go out there. It is super cold. Like the branches are super cold. And it had all this beautiful, like young new growth on it. And unfortunately, all of it died. Like it was already half dead when it got there. And you know what I mean? Like when you unbox a plant and it had new growth, like usually that kind of has some struggles in shipping. Not always, but I mean, sometimes it has some troubles, especially if it's hot or if it's cold. So in any case, I am like, oh my God, and I do not actually know if it's going to survive. On top of that, like there were only 3 branches on the plant, and one of them was completely broken. It was just broken. So I was like, oh my goodness. So it was kind of this horrible, stressful disaster. So I just sort of babied the plant. I kept a really, really close eye on it. But truthfully, if it was going to freeze, if it had frozen and it was going to die, there would have been nothing that I could do about it. Once an epiphytic cacti freezes, it's dead. Like, just dead. And it's weird too, because it's not like they freeze like pieces. They completely freeze and die. The branches that it had, they did survive. And so the branches that it had, it was actually this branch right here. And then the one that's back there. You can see here what happened right there is that branch completely broke off. And so it had this little branch right here too. So here you can still see that was cold damage that happened here that killed the tips of these. Only a little while later was this plant going to be going outside. So usually when I get a plant, I repot it, but I did not repot this plant because of the issues that I faced with it. And I actually still have not repotted this plant, but it went outside, and then just a few weeks later, it just shot up a bunch of like new little nubbins. This guy, this branch, this branch, this branch. So it just kind of started growing. And then just before it came inside, it did whatever this little branch is here. And I can see that something ate a hole into that. But so I don't quite know what's going to happen to that branch. But it's kind of interesting because it's like, well, how do I now know that this is not just Selenicereus anthonyanus and was like not mislabeled? So one of the things that I read about this species in particular, there are a couple of characteristics about it that can differentiate it. One of them being the tapering of the branches at the bottom. They are consistently tapered like this, so they are always narrow at the bottom like that. It grows a little bit differently than some of the other ones in that regard. The fact that there are no spines on it anywhere. Like this is the big difference between this species and Selenicereus anthonyanus. Anthonyanus always has like these little spines at the areoles, and they don't really fall off. So like, I think that this one could potentially have like a few little spines and then they will fall off. But to be honest, I have never seen any spines at any areole on this whole entire plant for the entire time that I've had it. Not on new growth, not on old growth, not on any growth, not ever. So if you have a plant that says that it is Weberocereus imitans and you look at it and you see these little spines at the areoles, 99.9% probably Selenicereus anthonyanus and is mislabeled. And then the last thing is the very curious sort of way that it grows. And we don't really have, we've got this. So this was kind of one of these things where it grew outside, it came inside, did that for like a quick second, and then started growing this out. You can see that there are just, this is really kind of difficult to see, but you can see at these areoles, there are no spines, none, not one. It's just not there, not anywhere. And I was always confused about the fact that the other ones had spines, but there was also this like kind of weird caveat in the botanical descriptions that was like, oh, but they fall off with age kind of thing. But other botanical descriptions, it's just not supposed to have spines. So the new growth, when it comes out, it always has these like little weird sort of like, it's just like a little weird piece of something. But it's funny because all of the Weberocereus produce new growth like that. All of them do. So, of course, this one was no exception to that. But even yet, some of that can still kind of look similar to Selenicereus anthonyanus. Now, I would suspect that this, well, there are other things too, I guess, is one, I don't see a lot of aerial roots on this plant. Not so far. There's one back here, right there, but Selenicereus anthonyanus will generally be covered in them. I'm not saying that under the right conditions, this plant won't produce aerial roots. It's possible that if this plant is grown in very high humidity, it will grow aerial roots. It's possible that if it is not enough light, it will grow aerial roots. So, yeah. It's possible, but I think that Selenicereus anthonyanus readily produces these aerial roots. Selenicereus in general are much heavier climbers, so they just grow a little bit differently and produce an abundance of aerial roots just naturally. You can see how big these are. These are actually quite large, but the original branches were not actually as big as the ones that grew here. I kind of think this plant seems to like it here. It's kind of an interesting thing. I'm like, it really does seem to just like it here. Which is good because, honestly, none of the other ones like it here. So, it's cold, it's wet, so I'm like, well, I'm glad that this one likes it here. Most of the Weberocereus like it here, which is good for me because I really like them. So the other really funny thing about this is the flower. So the flower is obviously a Weberocereus flower, and I feel like Weberocereus flowers require a special kind of person to love them. I am a special kind of person. So I just think that Weberocereus flowers, they have a very interesting, unique charm all their own. They're small, they're buds, they kind of look plastic, like they don't even look real. It's kind of hard to describe. They just don't quite look real. Added to that, it's the fact that they bloom at night and only last for one day. Now, blooming at night is kind of a weird thing because in cultivation, like being grown indoors as houseplants or, in and out like the way that I do, that something can happen where sometimes the flower will actually open before nightfall and sometimes it will stay open longer in the next day. Like I've seen this when the weather has been overcast, that the flower will actually last into the next day growing outside. And I have also seen this exact same thing when they flower in the basement because the grow lights don't come on, that when I very first go down there, the flowers will still be open. So you can mess with that a little bit indoors versus like if they're just growing in nature, the flower will definitely open at dusk or as soon as it is dark, and they will definitely die as soon as the sun rises. So it is, if it's not overcast, but I gotta be honest, these forests that these guys grow in, these cloud forests, they're way brighter than where most of us live, way brighter. So they live in these very kind of mild climates. Like it's complicated, but we do weird things with them that can just sort of cause weird things to happen. And I think that's all I'm really saying about the flower. So it's generally, they will be closed as soon as it becomes light. Pollinators for this, I believe, are bats. One of the very interesting things that I read about this species very early on when I was very first interested in Weberocereus, like I collected a lot of information and read it, was about the scent of the flower. So I had read that the scent of the flower smelled like wet paint. Later on, there was a gentleman who posted pictures of his flowering on Facebook, and I asked him about the scent. And it was really funny what he said. So it does not smell like wet paint. It smells like death. So, like, it is not a good smelling flower, apparently, which, falls in line with, like, the pollinators being bats. It stinks. So I've always been really curious to smell this myself to see, like, does it smell like wet paint or does it smell like rotten something or other? He was very, very specific in saying that you will never forget the smell and that it is very bad. So I don't particularly think that, I really think that it must have a horrible smell, which is really interesting because the other Weberocereus that I have don't smell like anything really. Maybe a tiny bit of floral scent, but nothing specific. The flowers are also small. They're not great big flowers. And that's actually one of the reasons why I say, it takes a special kind of person to love those flowers. I think especially when we're talking about epiphytic cacti, because when we're talking about epiphytic cacti, we're generally kind of in that like Disocactus hybrid, gigantic, very highly colored flowers. Like typically that's why people collect them. Like with most collectors, I think that speciesists, that's what I call people who like to collect speciesists. The speciesists tend to sort of gravitate towards loving a different kind of thing. This is what I think of when I think of like Weberocereus flowers. It's the kind of flower that is going to be very loved by a speciesist because it's weird. All the epiphytic cacti, Weberocereus, are just really strange, and I think that the flowers are just unlike any of the other epiphytic cacti flowers that I've ever seen. They're just really cool. I'm really thankful to have this species. I'm actually really kind of happy that the Fairchild Botanical Gardens, here's the pretty little tag, sells this species. I really wish that it was more distributed in cultivation. I don't wish that it was taken out of the wild. Obviously, it is definitely being endangered and only growing in a very small amount of places. It's obviously very endangered. But I think that the botanical gardens that have it would be very helpful if they did some releasing of this particular species into the community like the Fairchild Botanical Gardens has done, because it seems to be really, really rare in cultivation, at least correctly labeled, very rare. I hope that you've enjoyed looking at the kind of forgotten, I cannot bring myself to call it a Ric Rac or a Fishbone or any other weird, crazy name I can't. So I hope that you've enjoyed looking at kind of the forgotten, highly lobed epiphytic cacti. Also known as Weberocereus imitans with me. Obviously, if this ever blooms, I will definitely be doing a video about the flowering of it, and I will definitely talk about how it smells. So thank you for watching, and as always, happy cacti growing.